guys, what is going on? Red Mash here, and welcome back to another episode of Cards and Castles, more specifically another edition of Meta Monthly. Now, in this, of course, episode, we will be covering the time period between February, the end of February, and of course to today, March 15th. So, of course, again, 1 month since the last one. And things have certainly been a bit different. It's certainly changing up, which is a good sign. The meta is not permanently one thing. Of course, some we will see, or some months or some time periods, we will see a repeat like this week. There will be a repeat. But there's also some new decks in here, so it's good that there's more diversity coming into the game, or more specifically, the meta, with some of these decks. So, with that being said, let's take a look at our first deck for this edition of Meta Monthly. Now, of course, before we get into some of the newer decks in this season, let's just revisit a deck that's still pretty meta since last month, and that being trap decks. Despite them seeing a bit less play and them being, not as popular as they once were, I mean, they're still very much popular. We see that this decrease in play isn't really enough to push them off the meta, hence why they're in this video. We're still seeing trap decks, of course, in its Viking Ninja and Ninja Warlock variant. However, there is some good news out of this. We are seeing less of the Ninja Warlock variant, simply due to the stronger traps of the Viking Ninja, and what else is supporting the deck. Of course, the deck's strength and weaknesses remain pretty similar, so that being said, let's actually hop into those strengths right now. And of course, where better to start with trap deck strength than talking about, their main point, their main card, pretty much the card everyone's talking about when they bring up trap decks. And of course, that's the Dojo. Dojo still carries the incredible power to cycle rapidly and cheaply, all while reinforcing a player's presence on the board. Putting down cheap traps like Aijitsu Might of the Minotaur, which gives strength to their own units. Meanwhile, cycling out those trap cards to draw more support into their hand, whether that be ninja shenanigans like Magic Eater, Shadow Katana, First Strike, or Viking Strength, Chain Lightning, buff spells, or big buff units in the more later stages of the game. That you could argue that that's also partly thanks to neutrals as well. I know T-Rex is a very popular card right now, but overall, it just goes back to the Dojo. If trap decks are successful in a match, you will likely be seeing free traps being placed down by a double Dojo, which draws 2 additional cards every time a trap card is played. And that should show you why they're so popular. The fact that you could draw 2 cards for free with 2 Dojos out is incredible. And like I said before, they further their support with Magic Eater, which gets a buff every time a trap is placed down. And of course, Shadow Katana as a buff. Lightning Blade as a buff. Freezes from Lich or Frozen. Well, I don't think people run Frozen Storm, but I think they run Lich. I'm pretty sure that Liches run in the Viking Ninja variant. They can run, like I said, Lich from Freeze. Trapdoor Ninja as well to utilize all the trap cards being played to buff. Or Ninja gets buffed from traps. Anyway, this will all lead into basically them winning the game via total board domination. It's hard to say whether or not traps will be around for a while. I don't want to say that they're going to be this all popular faction. We still are waiting on the next sort of indication of change. We haven't really received any word on any card being changed technically since pretty much the bug fixes that came out a few weeks ago, and even then, those were kind of just bug fixes. I mean, it did slightly weaken Dojo because a bug did affect something with Dojo, so in a sense, they kind of got nerfed since last month in a technical bug sense, but even then, that's not a really purposeful nerf. You're just fixing a bug, not intentionally changing the card. So overall, Trap Deck's still a very strong, very reliable, I guess, deck type. I don't want to call it an archetype because traps aren't an archetype. Undead's an archetype. Knight's an archetype. Trap is just, I guess, a deck. So that pretty much wraps up their strength, and you can pretty much tell by the rest of their support why they're so strong. Cycle power, what else they play, just incredible mixed together. But that doesn't mean trap decks don't have a weakness. So let's take a look at some of those weaknesses. Similar to the strengths of last season, the weaknesses as well pretty much remain the same. Trap decks rely on the fact that their traps are going to be triggered for them to basically solidify their presence or solidify, in some cases, their wins. If you are unfortunate enough to trigger an Aijitsu, that most likely means your unit's going to die, unless it's a very strong unit like a T-Rex to a Lumberjack. But in that sense, you also have to know how to outplay a trap, know which targets your opponent is sort of pushing for you to trigger a trap on. Try to get some of the weaker units to pull off those traps. Like if you get a Hassan City Guard to have a Might of the Minotaur plate on him, then that means they might lose some of their plan. Their plan might fall apart a little bit, and then you could take advantage of that, momentary confusion. Of course, they also rely on the fact that they have the dojo. Now, I think I mentioned this last time we did this video, but in case I did not, or maybe it wasn't clear, carry building removal in pretty much a lot of the decks you play. And I know that's going to be difficult for some people because they don't play removal specific colors, but if you're playing yellow, red, white, or possibly green, even maybe possibly purple, you should be carrying some type of building removal, whether that be a direct burn, some sort of unit shenanigan. Yeah. Actually, yeah, you can play Pirates then. So let's say you could also probably pop in a Companion, but then that also applies to Kraken as well. So things with dramatic entrance, also good building removal. Just be sure to pack in any of those where you can, because if you're running into a dojo, they're going to want to protect that, and that's where you're going to want to target them. Because if you hit the dojo, they can't cycle and they can't cheaply place down traps, meaning that their units are going to be left exposed for a bit, and you can take advantage of that exposure to essentially put pressure on them to push, and eventually just get up in their face, into which they can't really do much because they can't afford to place down traps. They need to defend their castle. So, of course, that's pretty much where you have to hit the trap decks. Again, like I mentioned, they've somewhat decreased in play since then. They're, again, although still have a lot of users still using trap decks, so hence why they're on this Meta Monthly video. But with that being said, enough with trap decks for now. Let's move on into some of our newer decks for this edition of Meta Monthly. So on to the first new deck of Meta Monthly, and we start off with the Viking Pirate Good Stuff deck. Now, as you can see by the example here, I have one made already to show you what you could possibly be seeing when you're facing a deck like this. But essentially, this deck began emerging sometime around late February to early March. And while seeing a slight decrease since then, it still remains a pretty strong and a go-to meta deck for those of you who are interested in making 3K, or really, just want that 3K out of the way, depending on what type of player you are. But essentially, what makes this deck special is the combination it contains, mixing ramps, buffs, and strong static units. We can see from this example deck that the turn 2 and turn 3 have some decent, pretty actually strong, I should say, ramp in it. Those being, of course, Mugging and the Southport Captain. And if used correctly, they can launch you into a much higher gold count early, meaning you have the liberty to play cards like Minotaur and T-Rex, or potentially Ranger or Swordsman if you're playing these cards a bit later, say into maybe your turn 3. Or no, your turn 4, because then it will be +2. Yeah, so it would actually, you'd play them on turn 4, and then you would get 7 gold to work with on turn 5. And of course, these kinds of units showing up on the board, showing up early, really has the potential to create problems for opponents. And, of course, in addition, they are supported by Viking buffs, but more specifically and more infamously, the Lightning Blade. We see the Lightning Blade an incredibly powerful card, giving a melee unit +2/+2 and that Chain Lightning. Of course, you could also see maybe a Ludicrous Strength thrown into the deck if people don't have the Lightning Blade, since it is an epic rarity. But essentially, the Lightning Blade has huge punishing potential for Oblivious players. Of course, the 2/2, a very powerful stat to be giving to a unit. It pretty much changes the unit entirely. But the other sort of key here is the Chain Lightning. That has some serious damaging potential. It's the second highest base Chain Lightning under Ragnar, and it could pretty much take out any sort of weakened unit or building if played correctly or played at the right moment. As previously mentioned, with already strong stats units, of course that being Minotaur, T-Rex, Ranger, or Swordsman, playing this Chain Lightning on them creates a massive problem for opposing players. It just all around damaging. If a Lightning Blade is tossed onto a card like Minotaur or Tyrannosaur, you've instantly created another threat to deal with. However, the Pirates do contribute more than just ramp to the deck. The deck will also usually carry Voyager, who's been going around lately as this sort of sneaky sort of combo play. For those of you who don't know, Voyager can essentially decrease any monster card in your hand by 6 gold for the current turn you're on. So meaning cards like Grendel or Minotaur can be played on the same turn and for free. It makes her extremely dangerous in combat if you're up against her. And usually the monsters played alongside Voyager have the potential to transition into a Lightning Blade. So essentially you have a 3/2 plus an additional 6/7 to deal with, and potentially following that up with a Lightning Blade play. So again, just the combos of just pure raw power in this deck are incredible. But that doesn't mean the deck isn't without weakness. Now, the deck does pride itself in summoning their bigger units much earlier. Of course, that being any of the 5G plus units in the deck. However, with that, it sort of puts them in a position where they can only be playing pretty much one card at a time, whether that be a Grendel, a Minotaur, a Tyrannosaur on their turn 6s, then following up with a Lightning Blade play, which takes away most of their gold. So essentially what I'm trying to get at here is that these decks are only going to be playing essentially one card at a time, unless they've got some serious hidden ramp from cards like Robin's, Merchant's Estate, and whatnot. Then you could be seeing more than one card being played. But you could take advantage of these sort of one card play turns to your advantage and sort of focus in on maybe one specific target, or moving around one specific, maybe not moving around, but I think targeting is going to be your better option here. If you can systematically take down the units that your opponent throws at you, they're going to have to react in a different way. They're going to have to pull back a bit, let you breathe, and let them reconfigure their strategy, their plan. So that's probably one way to take them out. Another way is actually to take advantage of the Grendel in this deck to your advantage. If you are facing this deck, most likely you'll be seeing a Grendel, and its last will of giving your units a +2/+2 buff can be big. It can force an unnecessary trade from your opponent, forcing them to waste a card on your pretty much already dead unit. If you can create an additional problem for the opponent to deal with, or hell, if you could successfully trade something like a Witch Doctor, that's the thing that came out wrong. If you can force your opponent to play something like a Witch Doctor into your maybe already dead 6/7 or like less than probably like 6/3 Barbarian, then that's pretty much a win for you. This deck is limited on the burn cards because you are of course running Viking Pirate. The only burn that I would say, or pretty much direct damage really, is going to be the mugging. And while they do have ranged options like Dwarven Scope or Phantom Strike, in some cases they might use Dwarven Scope if their unit is going to be valuable enough. But if you can force them to waste maybe a unit plus Phantom Strike, regardless of what you're doing, you're forcing an unnecessary trade for your opponent. You're forcing them to take action where they normally wouldn't, setting them back a bit and letting you breathe again while you reconfigure yourself. So That being said, that pretty much wraps up the Viking Pirate Good Stuff deck for now. So let's move on to our final deck in this video. And for the final deck of this edition of Meta Monthly, we do actually have a bunch of different decks, but they all kind of fall into the same color and similar themes. Now, I'm talking about Pirate Crusaders here, and when I talk about Pirate Crusaders, there's a bunch of different decks that are going around right now that all carry the colors of Pirate Crusader. We're talking about just some good stuff decks. You've got greed decks, still existing and a little stronger. You have token decks becoming a thing now. So there's a bunch of different areas where we're gonna go, but I'm gonna kind of focus in on the things that make all of these decks work and the commonalities you'll find, with all of them. So that being said, let's take a look. Now, one thing to instantly note here is that this deck does share some similarities with the Viking Pirate Good Stuff. You, of course, have the Dwarven Scope in here. It's a very powerful, overall strong card. You got the Tyrannosaurs, which I guess a lot of people are taking interest, like I said, in Tyrannosaurus. So, not a very surprising card to see there. You even have sometimes Grendel being run in these decks just because of the sheer muscle it has. But something to really take note of, and something that's very important within the past two decks that we've seen, I don't think I've emphasized it enough in the last deck, but I'm going to emphasize it here. We do have more ramp, and that, of course, being Mugging and Southport Captain again. These cards have become pretty important in helping these kind of decks survive. With the fact that Southport Captain can give +2 gold next turn, you're essentially going from a turn 4 to a turn 6, and depending on what you're playing, you could be playing more than one thing or one very strong thing. Sometimes you'll see a Tyrannosaur being played, other times you'll see a combination of like Merchant's Estate, Rat Hovel, and then maybe an additional Mugging or a Sunflower. There's a lot of different ways that ramp can be taken, but it's a very important aspect, especially in Pirate Crusader, where you're using that gold to not just throw out big unit after big unit and then possibly buff. Most likely in this deck, you won't see big unit after big unit. You will see big unit, of course, depending on what you are facing, but you are going to be seeing most of the time more than one card being played, and that's what kind of makes this deck a bit more dangerous and a bit more reliable than the previous version. You see more things being played with that Southport Captain ramp. You could essentially go from a turn 3 with the Southport Captain to possibly next turn throwing down Armory, Knight of Flowers, still having the Captain, and now the Captain becomes a 3/4, but also it has repost damage, and now it's got 6 on retaliation. So the ramp is just a very important aspect to any of these decks. Greed is health. Greed's based around gold, if you didn't figure that one out already. But then you also have the token decks, which they play a little differently than most. You have essentially just a bunch of hovels and altars, since the only 2 spawners in the game can be accessed via pirates. Of course, one of them being altar or neutral, accessed by any faction. But then you have the Rat Hovel on top of that to play some weird token buff deck, and that becomes something else entirely. But they still carry the ramp. The ramp is the most important aspect of these kind of decks, and it's what has led them to survive for this long. In addition to what you find in the Pirate Crusader decks, you're probably more than likely going to be seeing a lot of draw, since we are in Crusaders, and on top of that, a lot of heals. So pretty much the 2 things that make any sort of competitive deck, it helps them survive. It's, of course, being thrown into here as well. Most likely you'll be seeing Forbidden City for draw, +3 cards into your hand. Sure, you discard 1, but that 1 could be something you don't need, or a random spell from Flux like we see in this deck. So the discard is not really going to hurt, because overall you're getting the same amount of cards. Hell, Divine Knowledge costs 1 more, and you're drawing the same amount of cards you are from Forbidden City. So what would you want more? To cycle more cards and just lose 1, or draw 2 for an expensive 3 cost. Now, of course, both how are being seen in the deck. Of course, some prefer one over the other. But again, draw very prominent in this deck. And we also see, of course, big Castle Heals, Arbiter's Return, Hand of the Saint. Of course, we've explained last video, last Meta Monthly, that big heals, extremely powerful, going to, just, to be single, or no, I was about to say singly, that's not a word, to be only featured in Crusaders. It's big for the Crusader faction, and on top of getting card draw, it just makes them a very competitive faction. Of being, of course, paired with the ramp from Pirates, again, very strong combination. But that doesn't mean this deck also doesn't have weaknesses, like, of course, all the other decks that we've seen here today. Now, of course, what I mean by this is that some decks, or most of these decks, try to throw a little risky element into their decks, whether that be Headless Horseman, which, let me just state right now, I do not. I feel like the card is way, way too overestimated. Like, I don't know why people are playing Headless Horseman. I mean, sure, it's a potential 6 damage to any target for 4 gold, but, not a card I would run really in this deck. So that's sort of a factor that you take into account. The Grendel we mentioned last time, giving that +2/+2 buff to any of the opposing units. Again, big sort of shift there if you can get that to happen. Or just simply sometimes that you can outplay them with aggressive pushes and aggressive burns. The deck does take some time to build, and if they don't have their ramp cards, which, granted, they are powerful, but they are few in numbers. Really, for the last deck as well, Southport and Mugging may be the only ramps in this deck, and if they can't really, protect themselves from early aggression, from early pushing, it might end up being their downfall in the end. Of course, though, we have seen multiple card TV matches with the Pirate Crusaders as well. So if you want a more in-depth look on that and maybe develop your own sort of strategy to take them on, because they are a relatively new and resurging deck in the meta recently. Like, I didn't think I would be putting this deck on here, but over the past week or so, they've just exceeded in popularity. They just exploded again in usage and popularity. So I would definitely say that if you want more strategies to beat them, take a look at Cards TV. There's bound to be a matchup with Pirate Crusaders on there. Use that. See what the guy is running, or gal. See what either of them are running in the deck. See how they're playing things, and learn a bit more about the deck. I can't really give too much information other than that at the moment, because again, recently just an overall popular deck within the past few weeks. Not weeks. I want to say like a week or two, maybe. I want to say more a week than 2, but yeah, I would say head to TV if you want to see some more gameplay of them, or check out the latest Cards TV commentary, which we did review 2 matches featuring Pirate Crusaders. So, giving you my take on if you want a more sort of more advice than just watching TV. But with that being said, I think that's going to wrap up this edition of Meta Monthly. Overall, very powerful decks we've seen here today. But yeah, great stuff. Great to know that it's changing as well. Always important. Great to know the meta is keeping fresh, or is being kept fresh and new. That's a better wording for that. With that being said, guys, that's going to do it for this edition of Meta Monthly. If you guys did enjoy, please make sure to hit that like button, share with your friends, and comment down below your thoughts on this episode of Meta Monthly, or any of the meta decks in general. How do you feel about them? Are you liking this current meta? Are you not? And if so, tell me why. I always want to hear your thoughts, again, in the comments section below. And if you guys are enjoying this series, again, be sure to slap some more likes on it. The last Meta Monthly we did, I think, did very well, so glad to know that you guys are enjoying this series as much as I am to make it. Always fun to see what exactly is going on in ladder competition and whatnot. But if you are new here to the channel, it would be appreciated if you guys hit that subscribe button, show your support, help us grow the channel just by clicking that subscribe button. I can't really say clicking fast. But anyway, that's going to do it for me for now. So, with that being said, guys, until next time, stay gaming.